Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Michael Neumann, the DEIJ coordinator at St. George's International School in Luxembourg. Michael, after some fantastic conversations that we've had and meeting at the ECIS conference, could you please share with us your DEIJ hot take that guides your work?
My hot take for today is not everyone feels like they belong in DEIJ spaces.
Wow. So, an excellent consideration. And I've been waiting for someone to speak about the reality of inclusiveness within DEI and DEIJ spaces. Could you please take us through what feeling like we belong in DEIJ spaces means? Why do you feel this is a hot take? And how do you make this a reality in the work you do?
Yeah. It's something I've thought about for a while. I think when you reached out to me a while ago about doing a hot take, and I had a bunch of different things I wasn't sure. One thing I always feel uncomfortable with DEIJ spaces is like if I belong, right? And then kind of noticing who doesn't belong. And I know myself as a white man, often going in these spaces, I've been told like you don't belong in DEIJ spaces. This is not for you, right? And it's that awkward balance of like, how are we supposed to be an ally? But at the same time, sometimes when I'm an ally, I have that guilt that like, it's not the right thing. And I know when I was like a homeroom teacher, I taught grade 4, for instance, for a number of years. And if I was doing like Black history, right? I felt comfortable in my class, but then also if there was like someone Black in the class or like, I was like, oh, this is not my thing. Like maybe I need to make it about them. And it's always that kind of awkward balance. And I've gotten really into, I guess DEIJ is the term now. I used to say sociology, then social justice. Now this is the kind of the key term now.
Yep.
And when doing this work, it was often like across schools, it's like, oh, this shouldn't be you, right? Like you're allowed to do kind of like Pride Month because you're gay, but like, it's kind of limited to what you're doing.
Mm.
And I've always found that like an interesting kind of balance with it. And through going into this work and telling people I wanted to do like a role like a DEIJ coordinator, I've heard in multiple spaces, and I was like, well, you shouldn't do that role. Like by doing that, you're taking space away from someone who's not white, and especially as a white man. And it's that awkward balance of like, I'm not awkward balance, but I need to, of course, be cognizant of my privilege and my positionality. And that's a key part. But myself, even sometimes I feel like I don't belong in DEIJ spaces. And it's an interesting one.
Now, I mean, sorry, you've shared like such an important experience. And I think through what you're speaking about, these different labels are coming up and the way the labels are used, it's like, am I allowed to speak about this? Or in some senses, some people would say represent
Yeah.
certain things. Um, in your experience, what has been the role of those labels of things like privilege, things like being Black or white or gay? How have you found that in making the space more inclusive or perhaps exclusive at times?
Well, I think I'm seeing now being like active in DEIJ spaces, I'm seeing like we're kind of missing a lot of people in this space. So I'm lucky with ECIS. I'm one of the co-facilitators of the DEIJ cohort. And this year last year we had like around 50 people apply for the cohort and a very limited number of men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking, okay, who's interested in DEIJ? It's very limited. And even in the work I'm in now at the school, there's, a bunch of different areas that I'm focusing on. I have like a DEIJ learning community. There's DEIJ task force, right? And there's probably around 30, 40 people involved in it and a very limited number of men. So I think one thing I'm noticing is, like there are certain people feel like they don't belong. When I'm asking, trying to encourage people, they're like, oh, I feel awkward. It's not my place going in there. Right. And it's trying to navigate this, in all these different areas. In like, I go to a lot of women ed events, and I'm a part of like Women Ed Luxembourg now. And I know at first I was like, oh, how do you feel with that? But I'm noticing that with myself, but also with students, right? And I think one thing I've really noticed is, especially boys not feeling like they belong in this space. So how can we kind of make that happen? And I think it's that balance of recognize your positionality, right? And you were saying like the privilege, but also making it seem like everyone belongs in DEIJ spaces, right? If we're only having, it's kind of like, I know we've talked about this, kind of the label, like the marginalized Olympics, where I feel like somebody's in this space, I have to be like, well, I'm gay and I have this and that, and all these different things, and we're kind of competing about like who is like more marginalized and belonging. And I'm like, that's not
Mm.
an approach to make an inclusive environment. So I think it's something that I just hope people can think critically of like, how do we recognize identities and structures, and that the fact that there are those who have, more power and less typically, but how can we make sure that also we encourage everyone to feel part of these spaces? Because what I'm noticing is it's only at, I'm going to give an example of at my school, especially with students, probably a third of them are white men, the white boys. They don't feel like they belong, right? Necessarily, they
Mhm.
feel like a lot of assemblies are never touching on anyone like them. So how do we recognize their privilege and the structures, but also make them feel like they're a part of this work on belonging and social justice?
Oh wow. And it feels like the concept of the complexity of our identities is coming up because, like you said, in different contexts, people may have more power or privilege in various ways, but there may be a context where they have none of that. And we're beginning to see people who are not feeling comfortable, not even beginning to see. The structures are as such that there's a concern that if you don't have a certain identity label, that you're not included in the space or able to contribute to the space.
Yeah,
But at the root, it's meant to be inclusive.
and
So if we have this binary of privileged and oppressed, or oppressor and oppressed, it doesn't. I agree with you in that it doesn't necessarily give the nuance to find togetherness.
yeah.
Um, do you have any examples where you've maybe come across that and then you've addressed it? You've seen, a student feeling excluded but wanting to take part, and then finding a way to navigate, perhaps by drawing a bigger circle which includes everyone.
Yes and no in some ways. I'm trying to think of. There's two stories when you mentioned that came in mind. One, I was doing like consulting with one school. I remember, and this moment really stood out. And we did. There's so many different ways to talk about identity. And I love so many of the different wheels. But there was one I looked at the big 8 social identifiers, right?
Mhm.
And I asked people like, how do you, where do you identify? And one person, was like, I'm guilty. I'm one of the bad people, right? White
Whoa.
straight man. And I said, ooh, the fact that you're, and like this man was coming to the workshop to learn, but it was kind of like, I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm guilty. And I said, if we're bringing you into this space and saying you're guilty, that's not a good starting point, right? Like how can we, and I appreciate what this person was trying to bring forward and recognizing his privilege, but I was like, and I could relate to that because I sometimes feel guilty when I've taken I'm in a DEIJ space, even though like I've been working for this for a very long time. Like, there's your personal experience and the professional. I have a whole lot going, like, in this area, but I still feel, and I've heard things like, you shouldn't have this space, you're a white man in this work. One thing that I'm excited with the school now, actually, and there's been a big focus, I was like, when I was doing my undergrad in sociology, did a thesis on like masculinity and bullying, but it's coming back, and there's been waves. But I think especially after adolescence, it's now kind of the focus on boys and masculinity is definitely reemerging. And at my school, I've been doing a lot of professional development, and a lot of staff have mentioned that they want to focus on it. And on boys and masculinity and having positive role models and a number of issues that are facing men. And also there was a student who kind of reached out to me and mentioned how he would love to talk about belonging and some ideas that he has focusing on men. So is it focusing on everyone? No, like, there's ways to do that. And I think the way to, so yes and no. I think the way to focus on everyone is really centering identity first, right? And I know my last school, we had a lot of like theme months. So we focused on like Women's Month, and then we shifted that to gender. We started with BIPOC Month, where we really focused on like race and racism. That was the first thing. And then we realized, oh, we need to celebrate kind of BIPOC joy. And then after that, we're like, you know what? We need to focus on race and culture. So I think it's shifting in a way from like the oppressed and the oppressor to like how structures affect everyone and everyone's kind of identity first.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds wonderful. There's different approaches whereby you ensure everyone can contribute to the space either as a learner, as someone who is gaining a sense of identity or exploring it, or understanding how the world reacts to however they are racialized or sexualized, or however their identity is perceived by society, but drawing larger circles which are less restrictive. Rather than saying, well, the women are going to stay together and work on women's identity, the boys are going to stay together and work on boys' identity. The men are going to, and we're going to separate by age, by perceived gender, and we're
Yeah.
going to go, hey, we all trying to get a sense of self here. We're all trying to get a sense through a lens of gender at the moment.
Yeah.
So why don't we all understand together and break down some of those barriers?
And that's the key thing. I think it's also looking at, like, I'm not saying we can't look at, like, for instance, with gender patriarchy, like that is a key part, but it's like,
Yeah.
how does gender affect everyone? How, you know what I mean? Maybe it affects women in different ways and it affects men, but, and how exactly, in recognizing those structures. But I think if, I mean, I've heard it from a lot of boys. They're like, they don't understand why they're learning about women's history because they haven't learned about gender and like themselves first. So I think it's kind of like we're jumping the gun in some ways, but it's that balance I'm going to figure out, because I don't want it that we're ignoring these social structures, right? So it's
excluding people by doing so. I could talk to you for hours. It's gonna ruin the format of these because we could chat. I would love to add a little bit to what you've said there in the sense of affirming it through an experience of my own, which I think echoes what you'll be saying, and I'd love to hear just a little bit of your take on it. But I will definitely say, as someone who has been racialized as Black and feeling within DEI spaces that's also almost my calling card. I'm valid within the space because of that. But simultaneously, from what is broadly racialized as the Black communities in the context I've been in, I've been accused of whiteness because of my education, because of how I speak, of various things, and whiteness being associated with badness and being an oppressor. And facing that tension in consultations I've done, in the interactions I've had with people, and feeling, funnily enough, excluded in various ways because I'm not allowed to be all the different facets of myself within the DEI space. At times, with specific individuals, they feel that I have to adhere to a very specific lived reality of my label that often they've given me rather than I've got. And I think this opening up of broader circles of the complexity of identity, I think, is the way forward.
I think so. I really appreciate your story, like, because I do, yeah, I love DEIJ. I'm so passionate about it, but there are, in some spaces I feel like guilty, and it does feel affirming hearing your story, or like how I think we're all kind of figuring out that sense of belonging, and I think it's kind of, yeah, pointing to the bigger picture of who really belongs in DEIJ.
And a lot of it being the expertise that we've built up, the intentional learning we've done about these topics, which should be the foundation irrespective of lived experience. Michael, this has been a wonderful conversation, but to keep things concise, I'm going to ask for you to share with us if there would be a key takeaway, if someone could only listen to 20 seconds of this and there was one idea, one reflective question, one concept you wanted them to leave with, what might that be?
I think exploring who is doing DEIJ work or social justice work, whatever we want to call it now, and exploring who's not, and what are the limitations, right?
Mm.
I think looking at that, kind of like what I was doing, where looking at within my different circles with DEIJ, with ECIS, my school, who's not participating in this and kind of why, and then having those conversations with those people and really listening to them.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that takeaway. I really hope people listening, please have a look into the work that Michael is doing and some of the cohorts he co-facilitates. There's so many learning opportunities there. The key takeaway of our consideration. Thank you so much for sharing with us. For our listeners, I'm going to place links so that they can connect with you and see the cohorts that you co-facilitate, how they can connect with you and hopefully explore your ideas and what you've shared a little bit more. Do get in touch with Michael. I thoroughly recommend it. And thank you for watching or listening. And I will see you on our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye.